The 19th Amendment and the issue of women's suffrage is something that I briefly talked about a couple weeks ago. And I want to play a clip here from Joe Rigney because he makes some comments about Christians' reaction to the idea that the 19th Amendment should be repealed. And then Joe Rigney makes this strange comment about theonomy that I want to briefly interact with. But as I've said before, the whole issue of the 19th Amendment and whether or not women should be able to vote, I think is really a distraction to the deeper question of this system of voting and democracy that we have in America, which is why Rigney's comment is strange, and I'll get to that in a minute. But this whole system of democracy where politicians fight for your vote so that they can make laws that benefit you, and even in this video of Rigney, I'm not going to play the other clip, where he's saying, you know, we need to get legislators, and we need legislation that is going to be pro-marriage and pro-this. He's bought into the system of man-made legislation. And so in the American system, the vote is kind of the highest sacrament. It's the vote in the American system is sacred because we've created this system of democracy where you are voting for someone to make laws for you, which is completely contrary to the biblical system, which is why Joe Rigney's comment here about theonomy as it relates to the 19th Amendment is so strange, at least to me. This is very odd. And I understand there's a lot of misunderstandings about theonomy, but even sort of just the basic foundational theonomic position, I do not think would support what Joe Rigney is saying here, and certainly not more developed forms of theonomy like Lancastrian theonomy. So listen to what Rigney says here about theonomy and tell me if you think this is strange as well.
One more little element on this, because a lot of people today, I think the 19th Amendment thing was kind of for a number of evangelicals and oh no. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me how many, I think that there's some Christians who are more theonomic than I am, mm-hmm. because they seem to think that certain sort of theological truths, we're all made in God's image, therefore universal suffrage is the only legitimate form of like political representation or something like that. Like it's a straight line in their minds from certain theological truths, which I accept, we all accept, image of God, things like priesthood of believers, but they seem to think that has this direct political entailment that the only legitimate form of government is a democracy in which everyone can vote.
Right.
And so I thought that was like an interesting like part of the conversation where I think that political regimes there's all sorts of flavors of how societies organize themselves, how states organize themselves that could in principle be valid. They just need to be done righteously and obedient to God.
With the key word being prudence.
Yeah, wisely.
So what's strange to me is that Joe Rigney says the people who are arguing for universal suffrage and the people who are arguing for democracy as the correct form of civil government, he says those people are the theonomic ones. And that, to me, seems like a pretty clear example of a straw man being set up. Even the more foundational Theonomy 101 position sort of laid out by Greg Bonson and others, just introducing the position, I don't see how you could make the case that they're arguing for democracy as the biblical form of government, especially as we understand democracy, and even as Joe Rigney himself wants a system, or at least embraces a system where you're voting for people to make laws for you. I don't think you can argue that's a theonomic position, and certainly not the more developed forms of theonomy like Lancastrian theonomy. We would certainly not argue that we're required to have a democracy because we're all created in God's image. And someone like Joe Rigney, I would think, would have a deeper understanding of the theonomic position. And if you would look to the Bible and say, okay, who should vote? Again, I think that's somewhat of a secondary question. Primary is God's law, the legislation, and God's form, the form of government. So I'll talk about that briefly. But if you were to look in the Bible, I think you had a pretty good case for head of household voting. So I would not come down on the side of, we need to make sure every single individual can vote. But the more important thing is, what are we voting for? And in a democracy, you're voting for people to make laws for you that will benefit you. The biblical system is the only voting that takes place. There's no voting for people to make laws for you. There's no voting on, ballot measures to make this legal or illegal. We have God's law. it's established. That is really, to me, the heart of theonomy. It means God's law. God has given us a law. It's enough for justice. You'll note there at the end of the clip, they mentioned prudence. And this is something we talk about often at Future of Christendom, which, by the way, go to futureofchristendom.org. There's still time left to sign up for our October conference. It's going to be here in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. So I hope to see you at that conference. But we often talk about the need for wisdom and prudence is in adjudication, not legislation. Because once you give man the prerogative, once you embrace the form of democracy and the legislative branch, you open the door to myriads of laws based on man's guess. And it's really ironic because it's what Rigney is accusing the theonomists of, which is, again, so strange to me, is what you get with a position like Rigney's. You have people now making laws based on quote-unquote principles. Oh, the principle that, we shouldn't harm ourselves. Now we're going to have a law that tells you can't sell raw milk to your neighbor. So, again, this is very strange casting of theonomy. The theonomic position, the biblical position, God's law gives us the form of government, and it's not a democracy. It's a very narrow focus of the civil magistrate. His role is adjudication. His role is to establish justice by appealing to the law of God. Cases are brought to the magistrate, and he adjudicates and appeals to the law of God as his standard of justice. So I think this kind of reveals that Mr. Rigney, and it's certainly not isolated to him, but I think it reveals that he has set up a straw man of theonomy, and maybe he doesn't really understand what the theonomic position is. Namely, God has given us his law, which is enough for justice, and he's given us the structure to apply that law. And Rigney's position, and you even heard it there, is actually, hey, there's a bunch of different ways you can do civil government. And so I would wonder how he would argue against a democracy. And it certainly doesn't appear that he's arguing against the American Lockean system of, man's supreme power to make law is the most important power in the civil realm, and we need to vote for people who will make laws, and we just need more laws, and we need laws for this and laws for that. That is contrary. If there's anything contrary to a truly theonomic position, it would be that we need more and more laws, because theonomy is God's law. God's law is enough. We need wisdom and prudence in adjudication, which is when cases are brought before magistrates. Our system, the civil magistrate, as it were, has an extremely proactive nanny state mentality where he or she is going around and making laws and funding agencies to go around and look for people who are violating those laws. That is the system that I don't hear Joe Rigney questioning. I hear him setting up a straw man of theonomy as being in favor of democracy, and then easily torching that straw man, but then still embracing the man-made legislative system. So this was a very strange thing for me to hear. Usually, and I've even heard it before from Rigney, usually their critique of the theonomist is, well, you guys are too wooden. You simply think that God's law is enough and you can just plop it down. And we've explained this before, that there's a place for wisdom and prudence, certainly in adjudication, not in legislation. But that's the critique you usually hear. But to hear this one from Rigney, this is sort of coming from left field. I'm not sure where it's coming from, that the theonomists are the ones who are bothered because Christians are talking about repealing the 19th Amendment, and bothered that we're not going to have a democracy. That's not the case. Certainly with Lancastrian theonomy, we would actually reject the entire apparatus that has given us all these laws and amendments, because God's law is enough for justice. So anyway, tell me what you think about Rigney's assessment there of theonomy. Is that how you view theonomy, as the position that we take all these principles and then turn them into rules, like everyone needs to vote because we're made in God's image? If you want some introductory reading on theonomy, let me recommend Luke Saint's book, The Sound Doctrine of Theocracy, and also an even shorter book that I wrote with Luke entitled Redeemed by Justice. And I think that will give, and I'm going to send a copy to Joe Rigney. I think it will help us to not create these straw men, I should say, of the theonomic position that we are arguing for, you know, the importance of universal suffrage and our democracy is precious. That's certainly not what we're arguing for. Anyway, tell me what you think about Rigney's comments, and I'll talk to you later.